Good morning from Cologne, Germany. Good afternoon to Southeast Asia. Welcome to webinar number 17 under the EU Southeast Asia CCCA Corsia. I'm happy to see so many of you with us again. Today we're talking about sustainable aviation fuels, as we have done it before a couple of times. But today we have a special momentum in the series of webinars because we have two distinct food producers with us, and they're talking about their perspective on the subject matter. So I'm really thrilled and happy to have both of them with us today. More about our speakers in a minute. Let me just give you a brief intro update for the ones who are new to this format on the context of this webinar series. So it is under the CORSIA project that is funded by the European Union and implemented by the European Union Aviation Safety Agency. And we're working in very close collaboration with all ASEAN member states in the ambitions to reduce CO2 reductions in international aviation. Our main areas of action are, as the name of the project says itself, CORSIA implementation, the support to the development and implementation and monitoring and continuous upgrade of the state action plans for the CO2 reductions. We are supporting on emission data management systems implementation, and we give support on change policies with this particular focus, as today again, on sustainable aviation fuels. Quickly about the project management structure. You see me in the middle, of course, when I'm the operational manager, together with Santi and Rebecca, both online, our project managers, Santiago and Monica, working on the communications field and heavily on administration as well. I would like to encourage you throughout the workshop to make use of our Slido application to address questions and for us to be able to give answers to your questions. So we will have regular pauses to look into your questions. You can upvote on questions you find relevant for yourself. It will be on the bottom right corner of your screen. And feel free to revert to us and to the speakers at any time. And on the next slide, here we go. You see the QR code. It helps you to access the Slido application, and please enter Sierra Alpha Foxtrot 17, so SAF 17 as an access code. Back on the subject. So sustainable aviation fuel, the producer's perspective. I will try not to make too long sentences here because the speakers will be able to speak about it themselves. I had really the pleasure some days ago to have a short warm-up session together with Stephen and with Mark, and I experienced two very passionate professionals who were giving me almost a small mini webinar, and I thought, wow, that would be great if we could make this spark, happening again in the session today. Stephen from Neste, a very prominent fuel producer who had the courage to really heavily invest into sustainable aviation fuels with big manufacturing plants in Singapore and in the Netherlands. Stephen, that's your field. You can talk more about it. And Mark, who might not be, many of you might not be familiar with him, but Mark is looking back to over a decade of experiences in terms of developing the processes. The Caphenia, the company Caphenia, owns, I think, over 200 patents already, and he's with his company planning also internationally. So we have two really different perspectives that complement each other, I think, very well. So, and as said, I don't want to make too long sentences this morning, and I want to give the floor straight to Stephen Bartholomeusz, as mentioned before, from Neste. So he leads all public policy and advocacy efforts in the company's engagement with governments, public sector organizations, think tanks, and other key stakeholders in the region. So we will share this presentation after the webinar, and you can familiarize yourself again with Stephen. Or Stephen, please introduce yourself, whatever I've been missing. And the next will be then Mark, with, as mentioned before, extensive experience as an entrepreneur, managing director, and developing innovative technologies for renewable fuels for his company Caphenia. So try to keep it very short. Handing over straight to you, and I think Stephen, you wanted to make a start, right? Please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ralph, and thank you to the EASA team also for inviting me for this session.
Stephen, if I may, could you try to come a bit closer to the microphone? On my side, it's a bit distant, your voice.
All right, let me try and get a little bit closer.
Better, perfect, thank you.
Turn up my volume and just give me 1 second so that I can share my slides so that everyone can see what I propose talking about. So I'm just going to get that onto sort of a full screen mode. So just give me 1 second. Okay, so I think you should be able to see this now coming up soon, hopefully as a full screen.
Looking good, yes, I can see it very well, Stephen, thanks.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much once again. Obviously, the topic today is sustainable aviation fuel, a producer's perspective. And what I'm going to touch on here in my presentation is a little bit, obviously, a producer's perspective, but looking at it both from what does it take to actually build a sustainable aviation fuel refinery, what does it take to get into this business, but also then looking at what does it take in terms of what sort of regulations, what sort of policies do we need to create the kind of demand certainty that attracts investments and growth in the renewable aviation sector. Because there's a lot of talk about projects that are planned and projects that will happen. But as we all know, climate change is not an issue of the future. It is an issue that's happening now. And if aviation does not take steps to tackle this issue, we are going to be kind of at the bottom end of some of the regulations that will come through. So with that, just to give you a little bit of perspective about the company that I work for, Neste, and we kind of like to always start with this slide, which is around our purpose. And our purpose is around creating a healthier planet for our children. Because I often tell people that what Neste does is create solutions to tackle issues of climate change related to transportation. Because if you look at our primary businesses, our renewable businesses, which is renewable aviation and renewable road transport, we are producing solutions to tackle this issue. And more recently, we are also looking at the other big issue around plastics and plastic waste. So driven by this purpose, today Neste is the world's #1 producer of sustainable aviation fuel and also renewable diesel, which is the kind of business that we started up many years ago. And also driven by this purpose, last year we helped our customers reduce 11.1 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions with our renewable products. And we have a stated ambition of helping our customers reduce 20 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. Now, to deliver on this purpose, we also need to do a lot of innovation. And this is why nearly 25% of Neste's total workforce is working in the area of innovation and R&D. Now, Neste as a company has been through a tremendous transformation, and it is actually a business case study for Harvard Business Review in terms of transformations, because we were not always a renewable fuels company. We started off as a company set up in 1948 to secure Finland's oil supply. But over those years, so starting as early as 1996, when we patented our next BTL technology, we've seen the kind of policy and regulatory movements, especially in the EU and the west coast of the United States, providing opportunities for biofuels. And it was in the early 2000s or the mid 2000s that we really started to scale up global renewable refineries, both in Singapore and Rotterdam. And then in 2019 and 21, we set up 3 sort of distinct renewable business units: renewable aviation, renewable polymers and chemicals, which also came on to support our renewable road transport business. So now we are looking at sort of taking charge of this change and moving forward. As I said, we have a stated ambition of helping our customers reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by up to 20 million tons in 2030, and also by that point process more than 1 million tons of plastics By 2035, we want to reach carbon neutral production. And by 2040, our plan is to reduce Scope 3 emissions intensity by 50%. So we are well on that journey, if you like, in terms of reducing emissions. And if you look at our businesses, our renewable businesses, we've got three businesses, as I mentioned. Renewable road transport is, if you like, the pioneering business that we kicked things off with, where we produce Neste My Renewable Diesel that can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by up to 90% compared to fossil diesel. The renewable polymers and chemicals business is our newest business unit, which produces feedstock for the chemicals and polymers industry. And then the one that I'm here to talk to you about today, which is our sustainable or our renewable aviation business, where Neste's My Sustainable Aviation Fuel has up to 80% smaller, 80% smaller carbon footprint when compared to fossil jet fuel. So what does it take to make these kinds of investments? And I'm just going to focus here on one case study, which is our refinery here in Singapore. So I think this will probably give you a good insight into sort of a fuel producer's perspective in terms of looking at this business, this biofuels business in the long term, and what it takes to really drive these sorts of investments. So today, the Singapore refinery is the world's largest bio-renewable fuels refinery, and it is also the world's largest SAF production facility. And Neste has always been bold. And we have 3 C's in our company, and courage is one of the C's. So what I would say is that Neste had the courage way back in 2007 to make a very bold investment decision of 550 million euros at that time to build a refinery here in Singapore exclusively to produce renewable diesel. In 2010, the original refinery started its operations with an initial production capacity of about 800,000 million tons. And over the last sort of 12 years, up to 2022, with various retrofits, we've managed to increase that capacity to about 1.3 million tons of biofuels per annum. Then in December 2018, we took a very bold decision again to further invest 1.4 billion euro to expand the existing refinery. And what this would do was to double the capacity of the refinery, so to give us an additional 1.3 million tons. And we also sort of built this new refinery, and the investment decision was made to produce up to 1 million tons of sustainable aviation fuel, renewable diesel, but also renewable feedstock for the polymers and chemicals industry. The other thing that this refinery could do is to really process a lot more challenging raw materials or feedstocks, because I mean, obviously that is one significant area of challenge when we look at the future of this industry. In April this year, the expanded refinery started operations, but unfortunately, due to a pesky little thing that was floating around in 2020 called COVID, the final investment on this project was 1.6 billion euros. And we now have the capacity, or we can now produce up to 2.6 million tons of biofuels at this refinery. So what are we doing here in Singapore? Well, what we're doing is we are turning essentially waste and residue, so renewable raw materials, into high quality renewable products using our NextBTL technology. So the raw materials come in, we use about 10 different renewable raw materials that are sourced from around the world. We have the capacity to run on 100% waste and residues. We then pre-treat these raw materials, especially the more challenging ones, so that we can remove all the impurities. And then it goes into the next BTL process where all the magic happens. And I have to apologize, I'm not a technical person, so if you ask me about the next BTL process, I may not be able to answer them. But very simply, what our engineers tell me is that we take essentially waste and residue, we put it into this process, and what comes out is, biofuels, clean biofuels. And we've had an output of about 3.3 million tons per year until the expansion of the refinery. So 5.5 million tons by 2023, including 1 million tons of SAF. And then with further investments planned in our Rotterdam refinery, Neste should be producing close to 7 million tons of biofuels in the first half of 2026. So just to give you a little bit of an overview of the refinery, I'm sorry I don't have a pointer. Maybe if I move my mouse around, you might see it. What you see here, where my mouse is focused on the top middle of the screen, is the existing refinery, or the old refinery, which covered an area of about 16 hectares in Singapore. The area that you see with the 8 tanks, and then on the left side of the road, where we have the next BTL unit, or the west area, is the expanded refinery, which now covers 29 hectares. So in total, this refinery covers about 45 to 46 hectares of land here in Singapore. In the west area, we have the next BTL2 unit, which produces sustainable aviation fuel and renewable feedstock for polymers and chemicals business. They also have a hydrogen production unit there. In the south area, we have this big blue box that you see here, if you like, this building, which is an enhanced pre-treatment facility. We then have our wastewater treatment plant. And then what you see here, these sort of 8 big tanks, are our feedstock tanks. So the feedstock comes by ship out here, is moved by pipes to the feedstock tank farm, and then pipes run under the road to the next BTL2 unit. And then in the main area, we have, if you like, the old unit. So this might give you a little bit of a better picture of what it looks like. So the area, again, in the middle, where you see the sort of yellowish lights, is the old unit. And everything with sort of the very bright white lights is the brand new refinery. And Neste's expanded Singapore refinery, as I said, has the capacity to produce about 1 million tons of SAF to support airlines globally, but also here in the Asia Pacific region from 2023. But making these sorts of investment decisions and moving into this sort of thing is not easy. That it comes with a lot of challenges. And one of the challenges is to sort of understand where the market is progressing. So where do we see the global SAF market, and what is the policy outlook, both globally and here in the Asia Pacific region? I think it's important to just look at transport holistically. In 2021, the global oil consumption was a little over 4.8 billion tons of oil equivalent in 2021, out of which about 2.7 billion tons of oil equivalent went into transportation. In 2021, renewable liquid fuels were around 100 million tons of oil equivalent. They were able to displace about 100 million tons of oil equivalent. EVs were able to displace about another 40 million tons of oil equivalent. So the challenge we face going forward is tremendous. But that said, with the right investments, with the right policy signals, we think that by 2040, renewable liquid fuels across the whole transportation sector has the potential to replace about 1 billion tons of fossil fuel. EVs could potentially displace about another 1 billion tons. And then if you look at new technologies like power to liquids and hydrogen, there is potential to displace a large amount of oil that is used, or fossil fuel that is used in the transportation sector. Now, if you just take SAF, over the life cycle, SAF can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by up to 80% compared to fossil jet fuel. Neste's My Sustainable Aviation Fuel is made out of 100% renewable raw materials, which include residues such as used cooking oil and animal fat. It's a drop-in solution. And I think the most important thing, I think those are the 2 key points that I would add other than the emissions, is that one, it's a drop-in solution, and because it is a drop-in solution, it doesn't require additional investment and infrastructure. And finally, it is not something of the future. It's a technology, it's a product that is available today. Yes, in limited quantities, but this is why even as Neste, we see we need more competition, we need more technologies. And when Mark, who will be presenting, comes on, he'll be talking to you about some new technologies that are available. And going forward, if we have to decarbonize aviation, we need all technologies. So Neste currently uses HEFA technology, which is hydrotreated esters and fatty acids, but we're also looking at new technologies, and I'll touch on that. So as I mentioned, sustainable aviation fuel is a drop-in solution that requires no investment. It doesn't require modifications to aircraft or to fuel supply infrastructure. We need to be mindful that currently the ASTM standard allows only for a maximum 50% blend. So what you see on top here is sort of your biorefineries, where it is then shipped to currently a blending terminal, where it is mixed with Jet A1, and then it can be moved to the airport fuel infrastructure either by ship, by barge, by pipeline, by train, or by truck. And then once it's in the airport infrastructure, it can go in through the pipelines, and SAF is allocated to customers based currently on a mass balance principle. As I said, SAF production capacity is increasing through investments by companies such as Neste and others, but we really need to move forward with more investment. So in 2019, Neste produced about 100,000 tons of sustainable aviation fuel. Next year, with further expansions to Rotterdam and the work we've done here in Singapore, we'll have about 1.5 million tons. We are looking to further increase our capacity globally, so more investment happening in Rotterdam that will bring us up to about 2.2 million tons of SAF, and then we have an aspiration to produce about 3 million tons of sustainable aviation fuel by 2030. Now, this is just Neste, but we do need other players coming on board as well, because as most of you might be aware, I think pre-COVID, the aviation industry used roughly about 300 million tons of Jet A1. The other thing that is required is that for long-term sustainable aviation fuel production, we need to scale up new feedstock pools, but also new technologies. So we believe that there are new abundant feedstock pools available to reach these emission reduction ambitions, but there needs to be further investment in these different pools as well. So by 2050, roughly, there'll be about 50 million tons of waste and residue oils and fats, which is currently what we use for HEFA technology. We believe that there could be about an additional 100 million tons of novel vegetable oil. So these are crops that are grown on degraded land that don't cause further land use change. So crops like Pongamia or Carinata. Municipal solid waste is another technology, is another feedstock that could be extracted. And then going forward, you have lignocellulosics, cellulosic crops, algae oils, and of course, powder liquids. So as Neste, we are innovating on several fronts. So we are looking at algae oils, we are looking at lignocellulosic feedstocks, renewable hydrogen, powder liquids, and chemical recycling going forward. But all these technologies will be needed if we are to achieve aviation's ambition of net zero by 2050. And what is going to drive this for a sustainable aviation fuel market? It will require demand certainty for these investments. And a lot of this demand certainty will come from the right policies and regulations. So if you take the Americas as an example, market growth in the United States is currently driven by a mix of federal and state level incentives, so opt-ins and tax credits. British Columbia in Canada plans to implement an aviation specific emissions reduction target by 2025, so 1.7 rising to 10% by 2030. I think we've already seen sustainable aviation fuel mandates in place in Norway, Sweden, and France. But all of this will be superseded by the EU Refuel Initiative, which sees a 2% mandate by 2025, rising to 6% by. Well, we see a lot of governments taking the right steps to really, signal to industry the opportunities that will exist in sustainable aviation fuel. So, for example, Japan has set a 10% mandate by 2030. Countries like New Zealand and Singapore are currently working on their own policies to create sustainable aviation fuel demand. And then more recently, we've seen, for example, the government of India announce a 1% mandate by 2027, as well as Malaysia announce a 1% mandate in the second half of this decade. So we see a lot of policy development taking place. And if you just look across the Asia-Pacific region, what we see as Neste is that sort of front-runner countries are shaping sustainable aviation fuel ambitions, which are very much aligned to those of North America and Europe. Just looking here, for example, in Singapore, where I'm located, the International Advisory Panel, which was set up by the Civil Aviation Authority, will be publishing a blueprint for a sustainable aviation IR hub in February next year. We've seen Singapore Airlines, Temasek, which is the Singapore government sovereign wealth fund, and the Civil Aviation Authority carry out a SAF pilot here in Singapore. There are different international collaborations like green lanes that have been set up. As I mentioned, Japan has a 10% sustainable aviation fuel target. Malaysia has set targets of 1% in the short term, rising 47% by 2050. The new government of New Zealand is looking at a sustainable aviation fuel mandate. And then just across the region, we are seeing more governments creating the right sort of demand signals that we hope would lead to more investment in sustainable aviation fuel. So I will close with that, but what I'd like to say is that to create the kind of demand signals that would result in a company like Neste investing over €1 billion, we need to have the right regulations and policies in place. So thank you very much, and I will now hand it over to back to Ralph.
Mark, thank you very much. Mark, we have a couple of questions received in the meantime. Maybe we could make a brief reference to these questions, and I need to ask my colleague Santi to try to show them. Santi, could you please help us on this?
Yes, just a second. So you were referring to Steve, right? To Steven.
Yes, exactly. And to be honest, I cannot see myself. I'm happy that I can be heard, but I'm facing some computer challenges here this morning. So
which one you wanted to address?
Let's start with the very first. So the main motivations and reason for Neste, for your company, to decide specifically on the location in Singapore to build up the SAF plant.
I'm happy to answer that question. I think, first of all, as I said, Singapore is right in the center, if you like, of the Asia-Pacific region. And Singapore has a stable government. It has the right sort of set up in terms of attracting large investments. And for a company like Neste, who source our feedstocks from over 60 countries, Singapore kind of made sense because it was very central. So most of our products, be it renewable diesel or sustainable aviation fuel, is currently, especially renewable diesel, is currently exported to the EU or to the west coast of the United States. And Singapore being also a shipping hub, it made sense for us to make this initial investment here. I think what I would also probably add, and I wasn't here at the time when that original investment decision was made way back in 2007 to set up the first refinery. But as you know, in the early 2000s, a lot of the first generation biofuels contained palm and palm waste and residue. And if you look at the sort of the two neighboring countries to Singapore, which are Indonesia and Malaysia, nearly 80% of all palm oil is produced in these countries. So going back historically, that probably might have also been one of the factors that prompted the decision to set it up here.
Right, right. So you almost touched upon the second question, and I must say I'm struggling a bit with the second part. So first part, is Neste SAF exported to all continents? And I have problems to interpret the question, or is there any specific end use? Stephen, anything that comes to mind by that question?
Yes, I mean, unfortunately, I probably had a slide that would show you the different countries, the different airlines, the different partners that we work with. But yes, Neste's SAF is currently exported to all continents. We work with over 40 airlines, and our product is available at a large number of airports across the globe. So, you know, just most recently, we exported our SAF to Australia, where in partnership with a local company, we provided sustainable aviation fuel to the Australian Defence Force, which was used by their aerobatics team. So yes, the product is exported to all continents. But of course, in terms of end users, it's the airlines, it could be logistics companies, it could be airports.
Thank you, Stephen. I was wondering, should we go for two more questions and then move on with Mark, not to change the dynamics too much? Maybe on this question on air traffic management, the linkages of air traffic management and sustainable aviation fuel. Any guidance you could give? Any references to air traffic management and this and what to what extent it could support sustainable aviation fuels?
That's an interesting question, I have to say. How can air traffic management support sustainable aviation fuel? I think more than the air traffic management, it's really down to the civil aviation authorities, who also then govern sort of air traffic management in terms of supporting sustainable aviation fuel. So it's down really to the regulators, to the governments in terms of supporting sustainable aviation fuel. I don't know how the air traffic management, as perhaps a specific group or a function, could support sustainable aviation fuel. All I would say was, if you're in air traffic management, I think you advocate to your governments the importance of supporting sustainable aviation fuel. Thanks,
Stephen. And I guess for the last one, for the moment, I think the short answer is a clear yes. Are mandates useful for SAF producers, or are incentives and subsidies that you need? I guess it's a combination of both, and you also already mentioned it, Stephen, and Mark maybe as well. I mean, it's
we need a combination of both. I don't think, I mean, mandates and or incentives are both useful to get this industry really kick-started. So a combination of both, or one or the other, are both useful.
Yes. Yes, Stephen, thanks a lot. And thank you very much also to the audience for the questions. And let me encourage you to continue. Please, just whatever you have in mind. There's no silly question. That's what we're here for. It is about exchange of thoughts. It is, and we keep this format, as I keep calling it, a work desk interview. So that's colleagues talking to colleagues, giving first-hand information on what they do on the daily business. So make use of this opportunity. And I would say from now on, Mark, how would it be? Ready to go?
I'm ready to go. Yes.
Good. Just share your presentation. Just overwrite what you see.
I'll do my best. And I hope you all can see the
presentation. Not in presentation mode yet.
Yes. Took a bit. But I hope it's now in the presentation. Yeah?
Perfect. Yes.
So, thanks for giving me the opportunity. And Especially, I'm always impressed when I see what Stephen showed us. That is really something that, gives you a lot of motivation, because ending up with a production of 3 million tons of fuels, renewable fuels, I mean, is really a large step. And from a perspective of a new producer or technology developer of sustainable aviation fuels, it's always impressive to see exactly how bold these decisions were, how early Neste made these decisions. And I think we all are really thankful that Neste really showed and demonstrated that it's possible to produce these amounts of renewable fuels or sustainable aviation fuels. So it's great now to follow up here. What I want to show is with Caphenia, I mean, we are a technology developer of a new pathway to produce renewable or sustainable aviation fuels. And what I try to do is to give you a bit more of a generic overview what it takes to implement projects in different areas. And I will give you also a short introduction to our technology, but at the same time, I think it's important to really understand what the whole ecosystem needs to look like to establish a really thriving SAF ecosystem and to implement successful projects in your different countries. So, in fact, there are 5 areas that I want to focus on. One clearly is technology. The second aspect is feedstock. The third aspect that was also raised in this question here is the regulatory framework that we need to emphasize times and again that it's really so essential. Last aspect, clearly, sort of the need to understand that we have to integrate not just the production of fuels, but then finally, I mean, there has to be a blending, refineries step, and also a certain role for airports to play in this field. And then finally, clearly, these projects need to be financed. And as we can see right in this situation, I mean, with these higher interest rates worldwide, we see serious challenges for a couple of these projects. So let me start with technology. So clearly, the big difference between the old world, the fossil world, and the new world is the fact that in the past, mainly the production of fuels was based on the fact that you have access to a fossil source. You are sitting on top of it. But nowadays, it is important to realize that almost all countries have the opportunity to become producers, because we are now talking about dispersed energy that we have to concentrate, we have to convert it into liquid fuels, and almost all countries have a certain amount of feedstocks available to do this. And fortunately, there is a growing amount of different pathways to produce these kind of fuels. So I will go to introduce our approach, the Caphenia power and biogas to liquid approach. But clearly what we have seen, the hydro treatment and road, the pathway, the gasification, there is a lot of potential coming from the production of hydrogen via electrolysis of water and the combination with CO2 with the power to liquid pathway. And clearly there's an already quite established pathway in the alcohol to jet route. So there are different options that can be chosen, and essentially what Stephen mentioned before, well, it takes all of them. We need to have all these routes to be able to secure enough supplies for the aviation sector. So coming to our approach, essentially what we did is we invented and developed a pathway that's a hybrid pathway using 2 different feedstocks. On the one hand, we have electricity, renewable electricity, but only about a third of the total energy that is used to produce these fuels comes from electricity. 2/3 of the energy is introduced via methane. And if you want to have a carbon neutral fuel, or almost carbon neutral fuel, you will base the process on biomethane. And if the biomethane is produced in a fermenter digester which produces methane as well as CO2. And the CO2 is a second carbon source that we need to produce liquid fuels. We have developed this system to be able to, in a single reactor, create syngas, which is sort of the basis, an intermediate product, a mixture of carbon monoxide and hydrogen that can afterwards be used to produce any kind of liquid fuel via established processes like a Fischer-Tropsch synthesis. You can even think about chemicals and produce methanol from syngas. But that is fortunately a pathway, the Fischer-Tropsch pathway, where we have the opportunity to produce 50% blended fuels in the aviation sector. The big advantage of this approach is really that we increase, additionally to the oils and fats that Stephen and Neste uses, additional feedstocks. We can talk about sewage sludge, manure, many waste streams, biogenic waste streams that can be used in these biogas plants. And to give you a rough idea, worldwide we see a potential of to produce about 600 million tons of liquid fuels via the biogas potential that we have. So in Asia, the potential is more than 150 million tons using all these potential waste streams, organic waste streams, organic potentials that are available in the region. That's quite a bit. So from our perspective, the big advantage of our approach is really the efficiency, because almost all the energy that we enter into the process via electricity and methane ends up in the syngas and then ends up in the fuels. So we have a total efficiency of 86% for syngas production and more than 70%, almost 75% for the production of the fuels. And if you use biomethane and renewable electricity, you can bring down the carbon footprint by about 92%. There's another option, at least I want to mention, because what we need to do is we need to ramp up the production. And one of the opportunities would be also to use a fossil source in the beginning. Because if we add natural gas, methane to the process, yes, you still enter a fossil source, but you can achieve, even if it would be just based on natural gas and you add additional CO2 from other sources to it, you would achieve a reduction by 25%. You can increase it to 50%, and by adding additional biomethane, you can come up to any kind of CO2 reduction. So there are even larger potentials to produce these kind of fuels with a power and biogas to liquid or power and gas to liquid approach. As mentioned, we started early, and this is something that I really want to say, and we have also seen with Neste's development. It takes a long time to develop these new pathways, and you have to spend a lot of money. Unfortunately, I mean, nowadays we are in a way more fruitful environment, because in the past it was terribly difficult to find the funding when there was the regulatory framework still lacking. So we had to raise about 30 million euros up to today to implement or develop the technology, and currently we're implementing our demo plant in Germany. That will be a full integration of all steps and ending up with the fuels. When we started about more than 10 years ago, we were able to secure patents in almost all countries in the world, including the Asian countries as well. So nowadays we have more than 200 almost 200 granted patents worldwide. Clearly, another aspect, if you want to develop a new route, is clearly you still need a lot of partners. You cannot do that on your own. So you need to have access to a lot of research institutions, which we fortunately have here in Germany. So one of the partners is the German Aerospace Center, DLR, in a couple of universities. But on the other hand, you still need to have, because we don't want to be a reactor manufacturer. We want to be fuel producers in the end and technology suppliers. So you need to have partners that are able to produce large facilities. In our case, it's MAN, better known for bus and trucks, but they are also very experienced in building large reactors. And they're currently building our reactor, but they have the ability to build a large number of these reactors here and transport it to any place in the world. So that's a good opportunity for us to really scale up the process and implement projects in all countries in the world if there's a demand for it. Next aspect is, as I said, if you want to set up this this ecosystem to be able to produce fuels, there are a lot of additional aspects that you have to fulfill or take into consideration. If you develop your own syngas route, which is at the center clearly and creates the largest value add, you still have, as I mentioned, have to have access to manufacturing construction capacities, and you need to have access to feedstocks. So if you really want to finance your projects, you definitely have to answer all these questions. You have to, do you get access to feedstocks? Is it secured? Is it a long time secured? And do you have the relevant technology available to produce the end product? And what is your way to, how do you answer sort of the logistics question, and how is it transported and blended in? And you need to have all those partners, because before you are really able to set up a new production facility, you need to answer all of that. And that is clearly only possible if you find the right ecosystem in a certain country. So that's technology. I mean, so if you have considered or found a way how you produce your fuels, clearly the next most important aspect is how do you secure feedstocks. And just to give a spotlight, what the probable SAF supply is going to be in the coming decades, this is a projection by McKinsey here. In this case, we can see that a lot is going to come from heifer, but there's a big difference assumed. I mean, what the respective feedstocks are going to be. So in Europe, we will clearly see a larger uptake of waste oils or advanced oils, and in the US, it's going to be more edible oils as well. And there's going to be a large role played by power-to-liquid fuels, because it's a scalable route. Anyway, we will see different demand patterns really depending on the regulatory framework, and I will come to that in a minute. As I have said, looking back at the last 10 years, it's amazing how the development has accelerated within the last 20 months, probably. I mean, with the regulatory framework now finally being set up and mandates created in many countries, we see so much more demand for the end product, and it makes it a lot easier. But still, there's a lot of questions regarding the regulatory framework in essence that are not answered yet. So it makes it terribly difficult in many cases. For example, in Germany, I think last week we learned that the best known project in Germany, West Coast 100, was cancelled. Yeah, I mean, they needed to invest into the power-to-liquid pathway, but due to the fact that the regulatory framework, especially in Germany, is not yet secured, they stopped the project, even although they received considerable funding for it, and still there are too many questions that are unclear, and the framework is not stable enough. So to invest into larger facilities, you really need to have a secure and stable regulatory framework. And in Europe, we have created a SAF mandate, and there are even sub-quotas. And these sub-quotas, for example, one of that is the renewable fuels of non-biological origin, or RFNBOs. So these are these power-to-liquid fuels. But it is not only the fact that you use CO2 and hydrogen produced via electrolysis of water. I mean, we even have come up with strict rules regarding how renewable electricity is produced. So you're limiting yourself to new facilities that are producing renewable electricity at the same time in a regional correlation to your project implementation. So in the end, that's pretty challenging to come up in the beginning sort of with the perfect project that you usually would may be able to implement in 2050. From my personal impression is make sure that grandfathering rules sort of are implemented, and those early movers don't need to fulfill all potentially positive criteria that in the end, in a perfect world, have to be fulfilled by everyone. To set up very strict rules is really implementing the amount of potential, the number of potential projects that could be implemented. So The big difference clearly here is, I mean, if you're talking about advanced biofuels in Europe, we have regulated what kind of feedstocks can be used to be advanced biofuel. And if you look at the US, clearly, I mean, there's a big difference. There's a lot more of potential feedstocks that can be used, and you're focusing a lot more on the carbon footprint reduction. And it has to be higher than 50%, and in Europe, it has to be end up to be higher than 70%, which is a bit, as I would say, insane in a situation where less than 2% of the fuels are renewable fuels, that you need to come up with only pathways that are almost carbon neutral. So ideally, you would have a lot more potential, a lot more pathways, and this will create a lot more insights, a lot more innovation, if we would be able to come up with different routes that are just 20, 25, 50, I don't know, percent reduced. Because then we would have a lot more of these learnings effect, and it wouldn't stop projects even before they are started. That is a problem. So in our case, our first insights are, or the current status is, that in our case, as we use, as I said, about a third of the energy comes from electricity and 2/3 come from biogenic energy via a biogas plant. Yeah, we end up with fuels that are a third RFNBO and 2/3 advanced biofuel. But this is still not 100% certified. So as I said, clearly before we make the larger investment decisions into new facilities, this is something that really has to be secured and safe. And my insight really is make sure that we have a lot of opportunities. Yeah, so to be able to really profit from the different pathways, and many of these pathways end up with syngas as a sort of intermediate product, and then you produce with the Fischer-Tropsch route fuels, different kind of fuels like renewable diesel as well as kerosene, renewable kerosene or sustainable aviation fuels. Ideally, you have the infrastructure to convert these intermediate products like a syn crude in co-processing plants into final end product and blend it in. So you can use it from different pathways like our power and biogas to liquid approach as well as the power to liquid approach. So we will not be able to set up a new refinery because we are still too small as a company. We'll be able to implement projects where we are implementing our process, and we'll be able to use that intermediate product. But then at the end, to be successful and really deliver to the airports, one needs to partner up with the existing refining and blending capacities that are established in the countries. So this is really important, that if you want to set up these projects, you have the ability to cooperate with existing players in the field. As I said, and to answer the question also that was raised a bit earlier, it is so important to have mandates. Yes, mandates really give you a long-term reliable incentive to invest into these facilities. And it's definitely necessary that we have mandates. Yeah, so by creating that framework, and now that it is established, we really see that we are approached by a lot of airlines that essentially are asking, when can we get any fuels from you, and would it be possible to partner up? So that is really a dramatic change to a situation only 2-3 years ago, where essentially everyone said, yes, look, we are just making 2 to 5% profits. As a player alone, we will never be able in a competitive framework, in a competitive market, to demand as a single airline renewable fuels and buy them. This is not possible. Now that we have created sort of a level playing field with mandates, there's a lot more interest, and clearly we will see a ramp up of SAF production worldwide now that there is this secured demand. But on the other hand, also to mention it, in the beginning, there are still a lot of insecurities, and so additional incentives are necessary, especially in the early stages when you want to develop your new projects and you're still sort of a front runner to answer a lot of those things that haven't been demonstrated. To demonstrate the full value chain in a project is challenging. So I would say yes, in the beginning, mandates are a necessary requirement, but additional incentives really help to speed the development of new projects, to accelerate the development of new projects. Okay, so finally, I would come to my conclusion. The big opportunity clearly is that if you look at the value add that you can create by implementing SAF projects, there's a serious potential in all countries, and it is no longer limited to those countries having access to fossil energy source. All countries definitely have a certain amount of feedstocks that can be used to produce sustainable aviation fuels. So it would really make sense if all countries would invest into their own SAF production capacities. But clearly, to be able to do that is the fact that you need to think about the full ecosystem, and that you really need to develop cooperations between refiners, new technology providers, feedstock producers, and the airports, and so on. And looking at the potentials, which we did in a McKinsey study, as I mentioned before, only a few weeks ago, the potential in the Asian countries, the biogenic potential is so large that really a serious amount of these kind of fuels could be produced using the organic feedstock potential that are available in Asian countries. So that's essentially all I would say, and I'm really happy also to answer questions that may have come up.
Mark, thank you very much. I have to revert back to Santi again for questions, and if I may just revert back to what you say on regulation, then that reminds me also to the small warm-up session that we had together some days ago. I recall that, I mean, everybody's striving for perfection, whether it's a perfect project or it's a perfect regulation. Perfection is impossible to achieve, and regulation is also, and we have touched upon this in previous webinars, regulation is not written in stone. It undergoes, it's an iterative process, rather. It goes a review, etc., etc. But it's better to have a maybe imperfect regulation in place than no regulation in place. If I get it right, if I remember right, Mark, right?
Yeah, as I said, I mean, without having a regulation, that the mandate, the decision by the EU to implement these mandates is really extremely positive. So positive. I don't know, 10 years ago, we were participating in this German aviation initiative for renewable energy in the aviation sector, and we were discussing how it would be to have one of these mandates, and everyone was looking for such a situation, and it seemed to be too good to be true, that one day we would have those mandates. Yeah, so it is fantastic to have them now in place, but still, one of the things is really we need to implement sort of a pathway where we communicate a bit more between the regulator and those that need to implement or that want to implement these projects. And this is really something that I would say has not gone perfectly in Europe, because you're creating currently some obstacles that are not necessary in the beginning, and especially to develop a lot of pathways. That's exactly so we have created mandates. That's the time of innovation now. That's exactly the phase where we need to see a lot of new approaches that will arise. So already trying to answer what is going to be the perfect pathway, which is a bit sort of the European way, I think is wrong. Yeah. So it would be better to be a bit more open. But clearly, it's fantastic that these mandates were established.
Thanks, Mark. So maybe now that we can see the question, and Santi took the initiative, and he already won a vote on his first question. So on the importance of having feedstocks close by the production facility, and how much affect the final price of the SAF and its life cycle and emission figures. I think that's also very much something for Stephen maybe to refer to?
Yeah, on the question of having feedstocks close by the production facility, I think if you look at the HEFA technology, and if I look at Neste's model where we get feedstocks from over 60 different countries, I think if you look at the current technology, as I said, which is oils and fats, they travel well. Of course, you know, if you look at the final life cycle figures, as I said, SAF can help reduce emissions by up to about 80%. And the emissions really take place in that sort of upstream process. So in the actual production of the fuels and the transportation of the fuel. So that accounts for about between 14 to 20% of the life cycle emissions. So would it make a difference in terms of price? Well, I'm not really sure, because I mean, most of these feedstocks are today globally traded commodities. But certainly when you start looking at some of the new technologies like cellulosics, it'll probably be more sensible to have your facilities closer to the feedstock, because those sorts of feedstocks will unlikely travel very well.
May I add to that? In our case, if you want to produce biogas, there are two options. For example, in Bavaria, here in the south of Germany, we have 2,900 biogas plants. They are currently not connected to the pipeline system because they are small, decentralized units producing electricity. So if they're too small, it doesn't make sense to use them as a feedstock supply for production of fuels. They need to have a certain size, because your facility has to have a certain size to have some economies of scale. But still, there are good options where feedstock streams are large enough. And this is really the model that we want to implement, where we would locate the syngas production and the production of the Fischer-Tropsch syncrude close to the feedstock production, sort of, because you can build facilities that produce 10 to 15,000 tons of fuel, and you can source that via a sort of a distance of 30 to 50 kilometers, these streams. But on the other hand, if you want to build larger facilities, it really makes sense to set up a pipeline system. I mean, in many cases, you already have a natural gas pipeline. And if you can then just introduce this renewable biogas into these pipelines, then you can build larger facilities that are more centralized, or maybe just located right next to a refinery or within a refinery. So you have, in fact, both options. You can produce the syncrude, and then the syncrude that doesn't weigh that much. I mean, it makes more sense to produce sort of the energy concentrated intermediate product, and not to transport the biomass over too large distances. So both a centralized approach as well as a decentralized approach are both possible.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Mark. But I can just, again, next question, maybe stay with you. There's a question specifically on the Southeast Asian region. For the new pathways that you have described, have you been looking into the region more concretely, and do you still already have partners in the region? And also, I'm sorry, the questions are going up and down. So
sorry, Rob. Maybe before.
What's your take on Southeast Asia?
To answer that, we have started, yes, discussions with a partner in the Philippines, and where we really want to develop the technology. So we are in really serious discussions to enter that Southeast Asia as a next step when we want to upscale the facility. And yes, it is, as I said, extremely promising. Not just the Philippines, Indonesia and Vietnam and other areas are extremely promising. As I said, there's looking at the global potential for biogas production. The region has an immense potential, and therefore definitely one of the next steps for us. We are currently in a situation, as I mentioned, where we implemented the demo plant and right away want to do the upscaling into a commercial size. And so one of the next steps is clearly for us within the next 2 to 3 years to set up at least in one country, a plant to use our pathway in Asia. So definitely very promising.
Thanks, Mark. Let's continue on questions democratically, because we see the upvotes, and the next is a bit related also to what you've just said. So the last part, which countries do you think will most likely become big SAF producers in the near term? Probably that's the view globally. And what are the biggest challenges to scale up the production of SAF from your perspective, from your practical experiences? Is it only financially related? Is it only feedstock related? Just anything else you can add to what you have already told us?
I know, Stephen, you are better in scaling up.
I think you've got, it's a whole range of factors, and I think Mark, you touched on all of them. I mean, the need of financing, the need for feedstocks, the need for offtakes, the need for the right regulations. There needs to be demand certainty. So it's a range of factors that will result in the scale up of SAF production. So you can't just pick one or two. And I think, as I mentioned, in terms of feedstock, and if you look at the technology that Caphenia is also working on, there are producers like Caphenia, also like Neste, who are working on new technologies. So we need more of these new technologies. Which countries are likely to become the biggest SAF producers? I think that's anyone's guess. I mean, it'll depend again on the market demand in those countries, and is it going to be purely for domestic production, or is it also going to be for imports? So I think that's a bit of a difficult one for me to
answer. From our perspective, I would say what we can see is really in Europe, feedstock is limited because it's pretty overpopulated, and the energy access to energy is limited. I mean, we are importing most of our energy in Germany. 80% is imported, so this will not probably change. We will not be able to produce enough. So there's a lot of competition for these feedstocks, and you can use biogas, for example, also to just produce heat homes and etc. Yeah, in the big opportunity is to use. And as I said, I mean, the infrastructure is established. We have 2,900 biogas plants. In the full US, you have 2,900 biogas plants. I mean, Bavaria, the potential in the US is 100 times Bavaria, or even more than that. So in most of the Asian countries, clearly there's tremendous potential to implement that. And clearly at this stage, I would say it's really access to feedstock that's the key driver for upscaling the production. At the same time, clearly we are not yet in a position where we are able to build really large facilities. So we need to see it as a sort of an upscaling, technological upscaling step that's necessary to go the next steps. That is limiting currently the expansion. But I'm pretty optimistic that within the next couple of years, more and more people will realize how large the potential profits are in the SAF sector. So financing will be easier than it is at this stage. But we need to have some successful projects to demonstrate that.
Right. Well, we all know, many of us, we know that not all sustainable aviation fuels are directly eligible under CORSIA. The sustainability certification challenges that you experience from your perspective, anything you could say on this question?
Well, from our perspective, not regarding CORSIA. I think certification in sort of the regulatory framework is more challenging within the EU than for CORSIA.
I'd agree with that comment, Mark. I think the EU certification is quite challenging, but again, there's a range of these sorts of sustainability certifications out there. If you look at the road transport biofuels industry, they've had to adapt to a lot of these certifications. So I think it's it will probably have to see what happens in terms of CORSIA.
Right. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Mark. So as I see 4 questions, maybe this is good to handle in the remaining time. So
So
the
Ralph,
first one is not really a question, actually.
yeah,
So it's
indeed, Ralph.
probably Santi, please. You're
Yes,
talking.
no, I think it's good to have this clarification. Indeed, I will quote it. I think was referring to how the European regulation applies towards the national regulations on mandates, and as it's written and in the European framework, obviously the European regulation takes precedence over the national regulations, and therefore it will embed the different mandates under the EU regulation. So that is a clarification coming from one of our colleagues in the audience, and probably someone who is very knowledgeable in the insides and outsides of all the regulatory framework. And I think it relates as well to the comment on certification and the challenges related to certification. Obviously, the regulations are made in the different jurisdictions, matching the political and technical intent of those policymakers, and therefore establishing what is the minimum criteria, for example, for the CO2 reduction expected from these biofuels, or in this case, sustainable aviation fuels, and therefore, by definition, it will rule out certain feedstock or certain processing because of not matching, not being high performing in the CO2 reduction. So that is probably also the associated challenges to the certification, the sustainability certification, and the different production pathways and use of different feedstocks. So just a clarification on my side as well. And yeah, I took advantage of having access also to the tool to place a question. So thank you, Mark and Stephen, for providing your views on my question as well. Please, Ralph, continue.
Thanks, Santi. Thanks a lot. And there's a very technical question from Marina. Thanks for that. So what is the SBC? I'm learning here while I'm reading. Synthetic blending component ratio in percent in Caphenia SAF. Mark, that's for you.
So a third, if I understand correctly, I mean, a third of the energy in our case comes from electricity. So the synthetic part, I mean, it's a fully synthetic fuel, but if you look at the RFNBO sort of as a synthetic component regarding the regulation, about a third of the energy comes from renewable electricity and CO2 as a carbon feedstock. So that's a third. And finally, if you want to blend it in the fuels, it's the regulation, ASTM regulation regarding Fischer-Tropsch is concerned. I mean, you can only have a 50% blend in the final fuel. So that's the 2 ratios that I would think are important. A third RFNBO, 2/3 advanced biofuels, and I hope this answers the question.
Thanks, Mark. Maybe now that you're talking, maybe on the last one, the bottom question, price band for the stuff you're working on.
We really aim to be comparable to the HEFA pathway. We can see that all the other pathways are a lot more expensive, but this is clearly the aim. We, with a much higher efficiency, as I mentioned, compared to a power-to-liquid fuel, and clearly the potential to have lower costs due to these waste streams regarding these feedstocks. There's really a potential to produce these kind of fuels with price range of about 2,000 to 2,500 euros per ton of fuel. In certain circumstances, it could be even lower, but clearly the key aspect is what are the final production costs, or sort of the power generation costs, how much is electricity, and then clearly on what kind of magnitude are you able to implement these projects? Do you have a centralized approach where you're able to source a lot of biomethane via a grid and sort of on an accounting basis, or it's a smaller projects? But clearly, this is our main aim, to be comparable to the HEFA route, and not to end up with these 5,000 to 7,000 euros per ton. And this is clearly what we want to demonstrate with our first plant, that we are able to do that.
Thank you, Mark. So, and then is someone, Subhash Menon, sorry, I don't know, I cannot read it from your name, my apologies, but it seems that you are already quite close to the subject. So, aren't mandates on the supply of SAF? In which case do you consider co-processing of low carbon aviation fuels to tap the huge bionic potential to create the 6% mandate required in the European Union? I have to read it again. Open floor to both of you. Stephen, maybe you can also support us.
Yeah, probably this question is more for the regulator, I guess. But maybe you can, from the producer's perspective and kind of detaching it from the actual regulations anywhere, see your views on the co-processing or taking advantage of the production of low carbon fuels to either take advantage of the CO2 that is being captured or any other kind of efficiency gain that you see where the mandates or where the regulations in general may facilitate or may support these different ways.
Well, from our perspective, co-processing is extremely important to be able to do that, because you need to bring down the cost of those fuels. And if you have the ability to use as I said, the existing refinery capacity, and you just want to add a new component from maybe different sources, could be power to liquid source as well as a PBTL source or so on. You have this intermediate product, synth crude, that you want to refine. So co-processing really makes a lot of sense from our perspective to achieve efficiencies, and it helps us a lot, as I said, I mean, to come up with different solutions.
Mark, thanks. And we arrived to the end of the questions that we have received, and I must say, very, very, very interesting question. And you can see also from the last one, you can tell that there are many colleagues here online that are not new to the subject. And maybe, do you see the 2030 goal of 5% reduction feasible? Maybe a final one. Well, it's ambitious, but
yeah. In this case, I think you have to really ask Stephen. I mean, he has to bring these amounts.
Yeah, is it achievable and feasible? I think it is, but it's going to take everyone, at the table. It's going to take all technologies. It's going to take us ramping up development of some of these new technologies, ramping up the kind of work that companies like Caphenia are doing, if we are to achieve that 5% target. I mean, as I said, Neste plans on producing about 3 million tons of sustainable aviation fuel ourselves by 2030. But if you take that number based on the 300 million tons of jet fuel that is used annually, Neste will only be producing about 1% of the total demand. And if you're going to get to 5%, we'll need other players to come up with the balance 4%. So let's see how that goes.
Stephen, thank you. Mark, thanks a lot. So, Mark, please.
No, fine. Clearly, we are aiming to produce serious amounts, but the challenge, I'm not the one who would say, look, we are going to be the other percent. This is a real challenge. We will not be probably able to add another percent to that by 2030, but we definitely aim to produce a couple of 100,000 tons by 2030. And if other players are coming up as well, yes, it's ambitious, but it's possible.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Stephen. I must really say exactly what we are into at the moment. This discussion, I think this is really the spice of this format. This discussions, this interactions, and it was a real highlight over the last 2 years to have you both here. And I must say, and that I'm coming a bit to kind of an emotional part of this format, because it is actually under this project. Oh, this is you again, Mark. Sorry, that shouldn't be. We're coming to the emotional part. It is under this project, probably very likely the last webinar, but it is not going to be the end. So it's the end of the project. We're ending at the 28th of December. And we are not stopping the initiative, we are continuing. The CORSIA project will end, but the new project is going to start and expedite as of January next year, with some new faces, some new people, but in essence, it will be a similar setup to what we have experienced over the last years in the CORSIA project. So it's funded by the European Union, implemented in close collaboration with all ASEAN member states, and the European Union Aviation Safety Agency. And the name we invented is SCOPE, standing for Sustainable Connectivity Package Aviation Partnership Project. So sustainability is a big pillar, a large portion of this project that consolidates various projects that we run over the last years. And a big element is sustainability. And my colleagues already confirmed that they are eager to continue this format. We have arrived at over 1,100 contacts that we regularly invited to these series. And whoever doesn't want to participate anymore, I hope it's not too many, please just let us know, then we delete you from the distribution list. But we found it a very, very great experience and a good opportunity to maintain regular contact with many, many people that we also personally meet when we are in the regions. And we have received many, many appreciations on that format and also confirmations on the importance, in particular as the subject has a very, very strong dynamics and becomes extremely prominent globally and in particular in Southeast Asia as well. So talking about it, Stephen, Mark, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your help. I will be looking forward to stay in touch and to continue in whatever format. And I know both of you are supporting us also in dedicated events and activities that we run. And I hope we can maintain this for the future. And again, thank you very much for the loyal visitors, participants. And I want to wish you all a very, very good rest of the year. And I'm looking forward to see you hopefully soon again.